We now come to motion number 3 on employment allocation of tips. I call Minister Kevin Hollinrake to move the motion.
I'm very grateful, Madam Speaker, and I beg to move that the House has considered the draft statutory code of practice on fair and transparent distribution of tips. The code of practice, which I refer to as the code, will give legal effect to standards in the allocation and distribution of tips, gratuities and service charges, and transparency surrounding the record keeping and the retention of written tipping policies. For brevity, I will also refer to tips, gratuities and service charges as tips for the rest of today's debate. Passage of this code will signal a landmark moment in our protection of workers' rights. For the first time, the government is ensuring cast-iron clarity about where tips are going once they've been paid and setting a new standard for how tips should be treated. Very happy to give way, of course.
I'm most grateful to him for giving way, kind of him so early in his speech. I just contemplated for a moment what he said just now about brevity. He would consider tips, gratuities and service charges as one thing and call them tips. But surely service charges, which are a set charge against some practice or some service, are quite different to tips which are for fun or voluntary or to add it. And gratuities come somewhere between the two, don't they? So I wonder if you'd very kindly enlarge on the this definition of those three things.
Well, it's our position that those things amount to the same thing. That we know from customer behaviour that when a customer sees service charges on their bill, they will usually not tip at that point because they believe the service charge is a tip. So we feel they're in the same category, which is why we've categorised them together in this place. The Employment Allocation of Tips Act was a relatively simple piece of legislation, but one with an important purpose. Following the justified public examination a few years ago about the spectacle of some businesses retaining significant percentages of tips or even keeping them altogether, the government committed to backing a private member's bill on tipping. The law mandates that all qualifying tips must be passed on to the workers who earn them rather than being retained by businesses. And it sets out that these tips must be allocated and distributed in a fair and transparent manner. I reiterate my appreciation, which I set out at this dispatch box earlier this year, for the cross-party support that the primary legislation engendered and for the positive and constructive tone in which all the parliamentary stages were conducted. And can I extend a further thanks in particular to the original bill sponsors, my honourable friend the member for Watford, and my honourable friend the member for Ynys, and subsequently Lord Robotham in the House of Lords. Today, we are another step closer to bringing these important measures into effect. It was remarked upon at the time that the detail was crucial, and we elaborated on that detail in December with the publication of the draft statutory code of practice on fair and transparent distribution of tips. I'm very grateful for the large volume and quality of responses we received during the public consultation that followed. Everyone who provided feedback, whether via an online survey, through an email response or in a meeting with officials at my department, should know that their views have been considered carefully. Responses have been used to amend and enhance the code and will continue to inform the communications and support for businesses implementing these measures. We were pleased to lay the updated code before Parliament on Monday the 22nd of April. The code was also published on gov.uk alongside a full government response to the consultation, which provides more detail on the feedback received by businesses, workers and other stakeholders. I trust that honourable and right honourable members have had or will have the opportunity to study the detail of the Code of Practice in their own time, but I'll briefly set out its provisions here today. The Code of Practice contains summaries of the key intentions of the Act. The Code sets out in scope of this legislation, emphasising that it covers all qualifying tips, that is, employer-received tips and worker-received tips over which an employer exerts control or significant influence. These measures apply to every sector and across England, Scotland and Wales. The Code goes on to provide more detail on the need to maintain fairness in the allocation and distribution of tips. Rather than being prescriptive and potentially burdensome to employers, the Code articulates key principles for employers to consider, protecting both the rights of workers and flexibility for a variety of approaches from businesses. The Code helps employers to engage in constructive and positive consultation with their workers and helps to minimise the risk of discrimination, which may be indirect or unintentional if due care is not taken. The Code sets out that employers need to uphold transparency in the handling of tips. This includes keeping a written tipping policy, which is clearly communicated to all affected workers. This requirement also includes retaining accurate tipping records to which workers have the right to request access. One thing to note here is that this need to maintain a written tipping policy and make it available to workers does not apply to businesses which receive tips only on an occasional and exceptional basis. Finally, the Code expands on how to resolve conflicts which arise between employers and workers. Whilst early and internal resolution of issues is preferable for all involved, workers may consult ACAS for impartial advice and for assistance in resolving problems. The Code informs workers about how an unresolved dispute may be escalated to an employment tribunal. Very happy to
for giving way for a second time. I'm listening very carefully to what he said, and I'm sorry that it wasn't familiar enough with the original Act. I should have been. I apologise if I ask a foolish question as a result. But when he mentioned a moment ago that this code of practice would not apply to industries which are, only occurs rarely, what if we expand on what those are? For example, if I tip a taxi driver, does it apply to that? Obviously not, because it's just one. If I tip a particular waiter in a restaurant because he's done particularly helpful selling to me, why should that be shared with other people in the restaurant? What sort of industry is he describing to which this code would not apply?
Well, as I said earlier, it is on the basis of an industry or an organisation that receives tips on an occasional and exceptional basis. For example, a Christmas box, a Christmas present for somebody who's dealt with, or for in an industry that's not used to getting those kind of gifts. He talks about the taxi industry, and that would be an industry you would say would regularly receive tips, of course. So he talks about a situation where a customer gives a tip directly to an individual, directly to a worker. That can be kept by the worker themselves if it's a tip directly to that worker, if they are not in the control of the employer. That is the difference there. So one given directly to somebody in a restaurant or another place, given directly to an employer, can be kept by that individual. But again, you would expect that to be set out in a policy at an employer level. Can I take this opportunity to place on record the Government's gratitude to ACAS and all those involved in the tribunal system for their continued diligence on tipping and many other matters of employment law. Overall, the Government is proud today to endorse the approval of this Code of Practice. Following approval from this House and the House of Lords, the Code and the other measures in the Tipping Act will come into force on Tuesday, the 1st of October. With this Code of Practice, the Government is righting a wrong, delivering a level playing field for businesses and continuing our proud record of standing up for and defending the rights of workers. And I commend the Statutory Code of Practice on fair and transparent distribution of tips to the House.
The question is that the Draft Trade Union and Labour Relations Consolidation Act 1992 amendment of...
No, we've done that one.
Sorry. I'm sorry. The question is that the Draft Code of Practice on fair and transparent distribution of tips, which was laid before this House on the 22nd of April, be approved. I think the Minister may have said be considered at the opening of his speech, but it's to approve. Thank you. Shadow Minister Justin Madders.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I hope we can consider then approve the Code of Practice. I'd like to thank the Minister for his introduction. I'd once again refer to my entries in the Register of Interest, but I'd also like to join the Minister in paying tribute to the honourable members for Watford and Ynys for their work on the Private Members Bill, which has led to where we are today. And as the Minister has outlined, we're finally here to debate the Fair and Transparent Distribution of Tips Code of Practice, which is necessary to deliver the provisions of the Allocation of Tips Act 2023. Now, I say finally, not just because it's taken a year since royal assent of the Act for the code to be agreed, but actually it's been 7 years since action was first promised on tips. As far back as 2017, the Conservatives promised to ensure fair tips for hospitality workers. In that time, it's estimated that workers will have missed out on some £200 million per year in lost tips. That's over £1 billion taken from workers in some of the lowest paid jobs in the economy. So it is a little disappointing that we see that the government have delayed the implementation of this from July until October of this year. And by calculations, this further delay will cost those in the hospitality sector another £50 million. But with that out of the way, I want to be clear that we will not be opposing this code. Action on tips is already long overdue, and we do not want to see it delayed any longer. So whilst we believe these measures will have a positive impact on the lives of workers in the hospitality sector and other industries that frequently receive tips, we do consider there is room for improvement, and I'll go on to reference the specific issues in due course. However, I will start by referring to the government's own consultation, which I think set out starkly why action is needed. In this consultation, the proportion of respondents that reported that they did not receive the tips to which they should have been entitled was very significant. Only half of those who completed the consultation reported that staff received all the tips. That means, of course, that half of the respondents to the consultation do not. And extrapolated across those working in the sector, this could be around 1 million or so workers who will benefit from this legislation. And of those reporting that staff did not receive all the tips, 21% reported that there was an administrative fee applied, another 13% said there were other deductions, and a staggering 11% reported that no tips were passed on at all. It is jarring that in the face of such clear mistreatment of workers that we have had such a delay to get to this point, but that the government then chose to delay implementation of this after discovering these staggering statistics in the consultation, I think does rub a little salt into the wound. But in terms of actual agreements on how tips are allocated, 73% of the workers who responded to the consultation reported that their employer had not sought agreement on allocation of tips, and that 40% of employers consulted did not pass on, in part or in total, all the tips to agency workers, and that's clearly something that absolutely needs to be addressed and is going to be by this legislation. But there, another reason why we face another delay, because clearly there are a lot of businesses that do need to get up to speed to be compliant with this. It does, I think, beg the question why more hasn't been done up to now, but I would ask the Minister, in terms of support to businesses, whether he will outline what their approach will be to working with them to make sure they are aware of their obligations under the new laws. What steps will the department take to ensure there is support in the areas outlined in the consultation where businesses raise concerns, areas like transparency, record keeping, allocation and distribution? I'm particularly interested in how the department plans to engage with SMEs to ensure that they remain compliant once the law comes into effect. Because workers will only benefit if employers are aware of and compliant with the law, so it would be welcome to hear the government's plans on this. But in terms of specific elements of the code, I would like to draw the House's attention to a couple of areas. In relation to the employer consulting with their workforce on the policy in paragraph 25, that does seem to me to be pretty minimal in terms of setting out what a good consultation looks like. Does the Minister envisage there being any opportunity, if an individual did bring an employment tribunal claim, for there to be an examination of the quality of the consultation in the first place? And the very important point at paragraph 26 does need some further clarification, I believe. It does say that the employer should review the allocation policy on a regular basis, although there is no indication given as to the timescales this should take place within. Does the Minister have any views as to what that timescale might be? And I make that point because we are dealing with a workforce that might well change quite regularly. And that leads me, Madam Deputy Speaker, on to the question of enforcement. And I'll repeat the old adage that people's rights are only as strong as their ability to enforce them. And the sector to which this Act predominantly applies is made up of workers in insecure, low-paid jobs, which are generally in non-unionised workplaces. Staff turnover is high, meaning that many workers do not stay with the employer or even within the same industry for long periods of time. These factors will doubtless have an impact on the ability for a worker to assert their rights afforded under the Act. Many may be unaware of the stipulations of the Act entirely, and even if they do, they may not be always aware of the ways in which they can enforce them. And particularly, again, Madam Deputy Speaker, if the government persists in their plans to reintroduce employment tribunal fees, it may well not be financially viable for people to assert their rights, as the fee for lodging a claim might well be more than what they're seeking to claim back. But there is something more fundamental to this. If a worker is on a 0 hours contract or another form of insecure work, they may fear that asserting their rights will be detrimental to their future chances of actually receiving work. I'll give an example. If a worker is on a 0 hours contract and is concerned that they've been underpaid the tips to which they're entitled and requests a review to their tipping record, as is their right under the Act, the employer might consider this behaviour to be stirring the pot and choose to reduce the hours they give to that worker, or possibly even stop giving them work at all. If they have less than 2 years' service, they could be dismissed without cause and have no claim for unfair dismissal. It seems to me that the legislation does not cater for people to be able to claim that have been unfairly dismissed for asserting a statutory right under this Act. If that's the case, then that to me would seem to be a huge oversight, given there is protection against unfair dismissal for asserting most other statutory rights. So will the Minister consider looking at this point again, as there is a real concern that unless people have legal protection and confidence that the law is on their side, then they may be reluctant to avail themselves of their rights. And in terms of the impact on the tribunal system, has the government made an assessment of the propensity for those in the hospitality sector to take forward claims? Has modelling been performed to judge the number of expected workers who will take forward tribunal claims? It does seem to me that the lack of proper protections would mean that the minority of bad employers will be able to continue to operate with impunity, withholding the tips that their workers have rightfully earned. So I would expect there to be, as a minimum, some monitoring of the effectiveness of the legislation. Perhaps some further thought to surveys or consultations might be necessary. After all, paragraph 35 of the Code says that, and I quote, "An employer cannot be said to have met its obligation to handle tips fairly and transparently if individual workers are not aware of their entitlements in line with the tipping policy." If we are to have confidence that those words mean something, surely we need to have monitoring to ensure that the Code is effective. And before I close, there are a couple of other issues I'd like to raise. The first is regarding when a worker is entitled to receive their tips for a given month. It makes reference to the provision that a tip must be paid by the end of the next month. There is a question about why the passing over of tips is not done on the same schedule as most workers are paid. And secondly, according to paragraph 13 of the Code, tipping by app is judged to be out of the scope of the legislation. Can the Minister confirm what exactly is meant by this? I've taken this to be a form of digital tipping akin to leaving cash, but I think we need some clarity on this and perhaps outline what kind of work the Department has done to identify which types of tipping practices will come within this, because there is a concern, Madam Deputy Speaker, that whilst I don't think the practice of tipping by app is widespread now, it could actually be seen as a way of avoiding obligations under the Act by introducing more app-based tipping in certain circumstances to prevent staff getting the tips that are intended for them. But in summary, we welcome the fact the government have finally got to the stage of being able to implement this policy. Sadly, we're going to have to wait another 5 months for it to be implemented, but those changes that are set out today will have a positive impact on workers who have been losing money that was always intended for them for too long now. We'll monitor the progress of this legislation closely and, if necessary, take further steps to ensure the good intentions behind this Act are delivered in full.
Dean Russell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And it's a proud moment to stand here today. This was a private member's bill that I brought in, with the able effort and support of my colleague from Ellesmere, who helped get it over the line. It's a joyous day because there's two things I'm absolutely passionate about. One is about fairness, and the other one is Watford. And in Watford, we have some fantastic hospitality locations and cafes and restaurants, from Jamaica Blue to Flourish Bakery, Beach House to the Tudor Arms, Sun Sports to the Badger Pub, Rhubarb Cafe, the Random Cafe, Casio Lounge, and so many more. I'd love you all to visit as often as you can, because you would get to see delights you would get nowhere else in the world. But the reason why I list all of those is because in each one of those organisations, in each hospitality organisation, in each cafe, each restaurant, there are people who run the business, but there's also many, many staff who work in the business. And since talking about this tips bill way back when I originally tried to bring it in with a presentation bill that didn't quite make it through, and then because I have a routine of never giving up, I managed to then get a private member's bill through luck and then get this through very much to with thanks to the government and especially the Minister on the front bench, who is doing incredible work in his team. But the reason why it was so important to me is because, especially during the pandemic, I would go and meet these organisations and I would chat to staff, and they were all consistent in their concerns about whether they'll get to keep tips, because there was a big shift at that time from people giving cash to somebody individually to moving to this world where cash isn't so common. And I don't think that's necessarily a good place to be, but that's the way the world's moved. And far more people now will pay a tip on a credit card at the end of a meal or at the end of a cafe. And I think every single one of us have said the same question at the end of that, when we've made that payment and when we give the tip, is, will you get this? And I think this is what this bill will help resolve. I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Most grateful to the Honourable Gentleman and congratulate him on this superb effort in getting this bill through. It really is a wonderful thing to have done, and I support the principles behind it. I'm just slightly puzzled, however, by one aspect of it, which is that should a restaurateur or bar owner not be charging the correct price for the service without any tip, without any service, without any add-on to it, and should he not be paying his workers a fair wage for the job they're doing, again, without any tips or service or other things? Surely his bill will set in stone a practice which actually some of us don't like. That I don't like tips very much. I'd much rather pay a fair price to the restaurateur and a fair price to the person who works for them.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman makes an incredibly important point, and actually it's at the heart of this, is that the fairness isn't just to the workers, it's to the businesses as well. Because the truth is, most businesses do the right thing. They pay a decent salary. There was I believe that the Minister can correct me on this, the legislation brought through a while ago which meant that tips can't form part of a salary, so they should be paying a decent wage. But the truth is, it's anti-competitive what some of these organisations are doing when they're doing the wrong thing. Because what they're doing is they're making profit off the backs of their workers by keeping their tips. And therefore they're making more profit off the back of their of their wages, or rather their tips, sorry. They're taking money out of the tips, and then the businesses that are doing the right thing and giving 100% of the tips to the staff are less competitive. So actually this is far fairer to the businesses, to the majority of businesses who do the right thing, and far fairer to the workers and to the customers who think that their money's going to them already and didn't quite realise that a percentage was being taken, or all of it in some instances. So what will this bill do? Building on that point, well, it will ensure fairness, and I think that's the key word that we should all take from this bill and this debate today. It will ensure all tips are paid to staff. That's 100% of the tips. It will include agency staff as well, which I know when originally talking about this bill, there was a concern from some thinking there might be a two-tier system for people who work. But also it will make sure there's a policy in place, a code of practice, which will make sure that businesses know where, ensure their staff know where they stand, and businesses will be able to be clear to everyone who works for them how the tipping practice will work. I won't go through the full list because the Minister did an excellent job of listing that earlier. But I think what's so important with this is that it's been a journey. I say about the fact it was my private member's bill and working with the Honourable Member from Ynys, but actually, as with all journeys, they started much earlier than I began the trek. And the reality is this began in many ways thanks to the fantastic work of the member from Bromsgrove, who, as Secretary of State back then, put into work the approach to look as a government into how we could make sure tipping was fair. And really this is built on the shoulders of giants. So there's been many members that I won't list now who've been involved in making sure that this bill came to fruition, but also many organisations as well. So I'd just like to thank some of those. UK Hospitality, especially Kate Nichols, who's done a fantastic job. The Nighttime Economy Industry Association has done brilliant work. GMB, you know, not often from these benches do we talk positively about unions, but, you know, fantastic work. ACAS has been mentioned as well. But lots of businesses and employers and employees who've really pushed for this to come into fruition. I'd also really like to thank some government and former government members, in particular the member for Sutton and Cheam, who was incredibly supportive when I originally tried to bring this in as a presentation bill. At the time, we were going to make it part of the employment bill. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, but many of the policies that were going to be included in that did happen through various other routes. The member for Loughborough, who was a fantastic supporter and able minister, and of course the current minister and his team. And I would like to, through him, because he's been absolutely excellent in making sure that this is pushed forward, through him help his team, because some of them were my team in my short time as a minister, and I knew the passion they had to make sure that we got this right. And as mentioned, I very briefly had a time as a minister, and during that time I had to hand over this precious baby of mine, the TIPS bill, to a colleague to make sure we could keep it moving forward through the House. And that's when I was able to speak to my colleague from Ellesmere, because I know that she has an incredibly important industry of hospitality in her constituency, and I couldn't think of someone more able and more energetic to make sure we got that through. And through her work and the work with Lord Robertson, we made sure that this got through and we got royal assent. And in fact, a story many of you will not know is on the day that royal assent was given, I was very fortunate to meet the King that morning in Parliament. So I'm sure that's a rare one for a pub quiz somewhere in the future. But the other person that I would like to give a huge thanks to is the lady who very rarely gets a mention in here, but is behind so many of these incredibly important bills, which is the MP for Castle Point, who does an incredible job giving us guidance as MPs how to navigate the very complex system of getting a bill through Parliament, but also to be able to give us confidence that it's possible. And she made sure that not just on this bill, but many others that I've been involved in different ways, flexible working, maternity care, leave, many others have got through and also gone on this incredibly important journey. So just to sum up, I think there's several things I just want to say. One is that this bill will help, I believe, around 2 million hospitality workers across the UK. That's an incredible number. But when I've spoken about this around the House, when I've spoken about it into my constituents in Watford, there's so many people, more than that, who will talk about the importance of this bill. Customers who want to make sure the money that they're giving, that they've worked hard for, as a thank you, gets to the people who they're giving it to. Colleagues who have family members who work as waiters or waitresses or work in bars, who will make sure that they get the money that has been gifted to them. But also, many colleagues have spoken to me and talked about their experiences when they were at university or when they were younger, who've also worked in hospitality. And I think what it showed to me is the important role that the hospitality sector has for our society, because actually it's often an apprentice approach for many of us into our careers. We learn a lot about our culture, about our society, about people, about our community through hospitality, and that's why in Watford I've been so passionate about trying to save our nighttime economy, but also across the UK. And this is slightly off point, but I think that also includes the need to make sure we protect the nighttime economy for music venues, because I think music venues are at the heart of much of what we've seen as a society in the UK, and I have a fear that that might be something that's damaged in the future. Hopefully this bill may play a small part in helping that. It's also, as I said, about fairness. There is no such thing in society that you can legislate for around fairness. It's a gut feel. But fairness is absolutely at the heart of what it is to be British. We believe in fairness in all parts of our society. And whilst this is legislation, at the heart of it, it goes back to the point that when you give money as a gift to somebody else, you expect them to get it, and that's what this bill will do, and I'm very grateful to the government for making sure that happens. I have a couple of points just related to this which I'd just like to raise with the Minister to make sure these are covered moving forward. One is about communications. Obviously, workers need to know their rights, and we need to make sure before October that there's a communication strategy so that they know what they've got rights to and how to access those and what they cover, but also to businesses to make sure that they know that this isn't going to be a burden. I recall during the early stages of being very, very mindful that we need to make sure this isn't a burden and more red tape to businesses. And I think the majority of businesses get that and they understand it. Those who are doing the wrong thing will no doubt kick up a fuss, and I'm sure we will probably hear over the coming weeks and months businesses trying to get around these regulations by forming new practices. I hope as a government we'll clamp down on those, we'll name and shame them, and I certainly will be very happy to do that to make sure fairness again is at the heart of this. And also I think there's a real role here about making sure that we're supporting as best that we can as a government the hospitality sector as a whole. It provides such an important part of our communities. It's at the heart of every village, every town, every city. Hospitality is often the reason why people come to visit. It's often the first port of call for a job, for a career, but it also provides such an important role around entertainment and culture. There's no other industry, I think, that has such an important broad role, and that's why I want to make sure we do that. So thank you to the government, thank you to the Minister, thank you to all colleagues across the House who've been incredibly supportive. Thanks to the member for Ellesmere, but also, can I finally say, a huge thank you to my constituents in Watford. If they hadn't put me here, this bill might not be going through today. So thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
SNP spokesperson David Linden.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow, genuinely a pleasure to follow the Honourable Gentleman, the member for Watford, and I want to place on record my thanks and congratulations to him for the private members bill which led to us getting to this code of practice coming to the floor of the House. It is a small but certainly a significant step forward to improving workers' rights, and regardless of our differences politically, and I suspect there are many, I've always found the Honourable Gentleman for Watford to be kind, thoughtful and very dedicated to public service, and I'm very grateful for that. And it's probably therefore no surprise that having won the equivalent of the parliamentary lottery, he chose to bring forward legislation which commands such cross-party support, and I thank him for that. Now, I will make reference to the briefing issued by Unite, the union, later in my remarks, but at the outset I declare my own membership of Unite, though I should be clear that I have no particular financial interest to declare. I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, one of the most frustrating aspects of this 2019 to 24 Parliament has been the lack of significant progress made on improving employment law more generally. Yes, there have been piecemeal bits of legislation, such as the Honourable Gentleman for Watford's, or that of my honourable friend from Cumbernauld, Kilsyth and Kirk and Tilloch East, or indeed the Honourable Lady from North East Fife. But all of these have come forward as backbench bills, and they've been very limited backbench bills. And it is, Madam Deputy Speaker, undeniable that a vacuum was created for these PMBs to come forward due to the sheer absence of a substantial government employment bill, which many of us expected, indeed at times were promised, on no less than 20 occasions by ministers. It's now 7 years on from the Taylor Review, and still no action has been forthcoming on the recommendations of that report. The UK exited. I'm very happy to give way.
I'm sure I'd like to correct the record. In terms of the Taylor Review, a number of things have been implemented, not least the right to request predictable terms and conditions, which went further than his recommendations. Will he acknowledge that fact?
I'm absolutely willing to acknowledge that there have been some recommendations from the Taylor Review, but the fact is that no significant action has been forthcoming, and that is why a lot of MPs, I think even the Honourable Gentleman, to be fair to him, from Watford, said it was regrettable that there wasn't an employment bill. So I am simply pointing out the fact that there was a promise that there would be an employment bill in this Parliament. We've found time to legislate on a whole manner of other issues, some of which have frankly been with a view to creating a wedge at the general election, whereas we know that the legislative framework that we have around employment law is not necessarily fit for the 21st century and the kind of economy that we have now. But I'll come on to the fact that the UK exited the European Union in January 2020 to cheers and trumpets from Brexiteers who promised that Britannia Unchained from Brussels would lead to an improvement in workers' rights. But in reality, and from what I can see in Glasgow, all that has happened is that employers in the hospitality and tourism sectors now just have fewer workers. Now, in citing the briefing from Unite, I want to thank them for the work that they've done to engage with employees and to gauge those opinions when it comes specifically to tipping policy. The context for this, of course, is that those who have responded are already engaged trade unionists with a track record of activism and a pretty decent understanding of policy. And I think that's what makes the following answers particularly striking. Because when asking whether an employee's workplace passed on all tips to its staff, the answers were yes, 63%, don't know, 21%, no, 11%, and 5% indicated that tips were only accepted by card on an employer-operated tronic, which employees paid tax on. So I think that therefore paints a picture of the sheer scale of the issues workers face, especially when it comes to tipping and hospitality. Now, there are also some other issues which I think need to be just ironed out a bit further and considered a little bit more when it comes to tipping policy, namely whether or not backroom staff, for those who are integral to preparing and producing a meal, not just delivering it to the table, be tipped, and whether the tips are being distributed equitably. All workers need to be eligible to receive tips, whether they're on 0 hours contracts, whether they're permanent employees. I know that progress has been made in terms of extending it to agency workers. But I think that the reality, and it goes back to the point I made earlier on, the reality is that we operate now in a gig economy, and it's vital that the legislative framework that comes from this place reflects that. Because from the government's response to the consultation, 40% of employers admit that they do not issue tips to agency workers, despite this being an obligation under Section 27H of the Employment Right Act of 1996. I think that the Honourable Gentleman from Watford was absolutely spot on to make clear that the comms, not just to employers, but in terms of employees as well, have to be very clear in the run-up to October this year. There must be something that can be done, for example, the fact that employees still receive a pay slip. Could the government bring forward measures, for example, that would require all employers to put some sort of small note on pay slips just to make clear for a couple of months that the laws on tipping have changed? Now, the legislation that we're piloting through the House at the moment makes the point that our framework for legislation does not necessarily reflect the reality of the UK economy and labour force in 2024, and that more needs to be done to protect workers, especially those on 0 hours contracts. And that's arguably a point that I think should weigh heavily on the minds of those shadow ministers who, if polls are to be believed, might shortly be assuming red boxes in Whitehall offices in the coming months. And as we approach the cigarette end of this Parliament, attention turns to the incoming government and its ambitions for workers' rights. And it would be fair to say that the small c Conservative approach to workers' rights from the official opposition has not necessarily been wholly welcomed by those in the Labour movement. Only last week, Unite's General Secretary Sharon Graham was on record as saying, and I'll quote it into the record, "It looks like all the warnings Unite made earlier about the dangers of Labour rowing back in its pledges for the New Deal for workers have been proved right. This new Labour document on the New Deal, issued to unions on Monday, is a rollback on a rollback. It is totally unrecognisable from the original proposals produced with the unions. Unrecognisable. Workers will see through this and mark this as a retreat after retreat and mark it as a betrayal. This new document is turning out to what was a new deal for workers and as a charter for bad bosses. Labour don't want a law against fire and rehire, and they're effectively ripping up the promise of legislation on a new deal for workers in its first 100 days.
The Honourable Gentleman will be coming back to the motion before us.
I'm very happy to inform Madam Deputy Speaker that I am talking on employment legislation, which I believe that this is germane to. Instead, we have codes of conduct and pledges of consultations with big business. Likewise, the proposal to legislate against 0 hours contracts is watered down to almost nothing. In truth, this new document is not worthy of discussion. All unions must demand that Labour change course and put the original New Deal for workers back on the table. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, that was a warning shot to the Labour Party that they too must be more ambitious and not leave protecting workers' rights to the valiant efforts of backbench MPs who happen to be lucky in the private members' bill draw. Now, I will, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm sure you'll be glad to know, draw my remarks to a close and say, yes, the measures before us today have the potential to put up to £200 million a year back into the pockets of hospitality staff and could benefit more than 2 million workers across the hospitality, leisure and service sectors. That is a legislative achievement to be rightly celebrated in this place, but it does, I'm afraid, come against a backdrop of increasing legislation which restricts the rights of trade unions to exercise functions of collective bargaining. And it is therefore no surprise that the UK has now some of the most restrictive trade union laws in Western Europe, something which has only got worse over the last decade. Workers deserve better, and today is another baby step to improving things, but it largely goes against the grain of Westminster policy formulation when it comes to workers' rights. And it's frankly therefore little wonder that the Labour movement in Scotland, so ably represented by the Scottish Trade Union Congress, has now concluded that legislative competence for employment law should be devolved to Scottish ministers. And failure to do so, be that by Labour or the Tories, will lead Scots to conclude one thing and one thing only, that Westminster is not working for working people.
Crosbie.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm delighted to be standing here on the day that this Code of Practice is approved by this House. When I took over the sponsorship of the Employment Allocation of Tips Private Members Bill, which was introduced by my honourable friend, the member and champion for Watford due to his promotion, I knew just how important it would be to the pockets of millions across the UK, and particularly in my constituency of Ynys. This bill is about fairness, it's about transparency, it's about reducing discrimination, and it's about creating a level playing field for businesses. And importantly, the code will enable disputes to be resolved quickly and fairly. 8% of people in the UK work in the tourism sector. That rises to 11% in Wales and a whopping 18% on Ynys. That's right, almost 1 in 5 are employed in the tourism and hospitality sector in my constituency of Ynys. And if, as is estimated, this Act gives workers in the sector an average £200 per year more into their pockets, then a rough calculation suggests that this Act alone could generate around £900,000 for workers across Ynys annually. And as someone who financed my A-level and university studies by waitressing, I know firsthand how important tips are. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill is not a nuclear power station, it's not a free port, but it is significant. It's significant to local workers and families struggling with the cost of living. And I have to say that those working in hospitality and tourism on Anglesey are a fantastic bunch and dedicated to supporting our local communities in so many ways. The team in the Oyster Catcher in Rosnaga are working with community champion Sue Gillett to help raise funds in Mirili Morn as part of Dementia Week this Thursday. At Catch 22 in Valley, Neil, Mel and the team support local farmers through their farmers' markets. The Driftwood in Triartha Bay hosts fabulous quizzes to raise funds for local community groups like the Scouts, SAFA and the RNLI. And Dave and Amanda Jones from Anglesey Fishing Trips do so much to reach out to our tourism and local community. Madam Deputy Speaker, there are so many fantastic people and communities that will benefit from this Act, particularly those on Ynys Môn. And I'm proud to see, with the approval of the Code of Practice, that this legislation is moving another step closer. Diolch yn fawr.
Yeah.
Minister.
Well, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank honourable members and right honourable members for their contributions during this debate. This debate, Madam Deputy Speaker, where we seek to ensure that the draft statutory code of practice on fair and transparent distribution of tips be approved. If I can turn to the specific issues raised by honourable members. The Shadow Minister spoke first, of course. He talked about engagement with the sector, very important, of course, and we engage regularly with organisations such as UK Hospitality, British Beer and Pub Association, the British Innkeepers Institute, on these matters, and have been done for many months, of course, in terms of making sure their views are heard. And indeed, the guidance, the non-statutory guidance that we will bring forward should provide more help for those organisations to comply with the important provisions of this legislation. It talks about whether we'd review the policy on a regular basis. We will obviously keep all these matters under review, and the guidance should help to, again, inform the sector about requirements, both in terms of both employees and in terms of businesses. Hugely important that we do so. In terms of his point about would somebody be able to take a claim forward to an employment tribunal for unfair dismissal? Clearly, employment tribunals are there to make sure workers can assert their rights if they feel those rights have not been respected. So we would expect an employment tribunal definitely to hear such a case. He asked about tipping by apps or digital apps, and we see this as a new phenomenon, which is a interesting development, and we see the ability now for example, a customer to be able to tip an individual using an app or QR code or whatever, and we're not standing in the way of that, where it's quite clear where a tip has been given directly to a member of staff that can be kept. That tip can be kept by that member of staff, and it's there to try and allow flexibility in terms of the provisions of both the code and the guidance will be, rather than trying to allow businesses to avoid their clear obligations. He asked about when payments will be made and why is it a month following. I think it's quite reasonable to expect a business to be able to calculate the amount of tips and add up the amount of tips in a month and pay those tips out to workers in the month following. We think that's a reasonable balance to strike. In terms of his point of why we're taking another 5 months to put this in place, clearly we want to make sure two things really. We get it right, but also we respect some of the pressures in the hospitality sector, of course, which has been through a difficult time with things like increases through the national living wage, cost of living crisis, and indeed the COVID crisis. So we're trying to make sure that we take the sector with us rather than impose new burdens that are unfair. And we don't think these are unfair because we know the majority of businesses will adopt these kind of rules even without this legislation. The Honourable Member for Glasgow East, he seemed to imply that people on this side of the House were going to use Brexit, claiming we use Brexit to improve workers' rights, and I'm always keen to improve workers' rights, as we have done in this Parliament, but I seem to remember his party clearly saying Brexit would be a bonfire of workers' rights, and that certainly has not been the case. Happy to give way, of course.
Does he consider, therefore, that workers' rights have got better? And why is it that, therefore, like trade union organisations across Europe recognise the UK as having some of the worst employment rights across Europe?
Yes, I absolutely think they've got better legislation that myself and my colleagues have brought forward in this Parliament. Flexible working, right to request for flexible working, neonatal care leave, carers leave, protection for redundancy and return to work from maternity, the right to request predictable terms and conditions, the tipping bill, shared parental leave. All those things have been brought forward by this government, or supported by this government. We don't see these things as an opportunity to create a wedge issue. We see these as the right thing, which I think he said, we think the right thing to do by our workers.
Trying to tell the House that the former Secretary of State, the Right Honourable Gentleman from Welland Hatfield, did not relish the opportunity to bring forward the minimum strikes legislation bill as a wedge issue to cause trouble with the Labour Party. Come on.
Well, this is a refrain that we constantly hear from the SNP, and what I noticed in his speech, he did refer, to be fair to him, making sure we work alongside hospitality in terms of guidance. But apart from that, there was nothing in his remarks about the needs of business. And that legislation was about the needs of business. The strikes that affected this country, particularly at the end of last year and the year before last, cost the hospitality sector around £3 billion. That's why we legislated as we did, and we feel it's the right thing to do. And he'd do well to reflect further on this in terms of the needs of business as well as the needs of workers. We believe there is a balance to be struck, and I think he's got that balance wrong in Scotland. And don't listen to me, look at the numbers. Look at the economic growth in Scotland over the 10-year period, most recent figures, 2011 to 2021. Scotland, economic growth, cumulative GDP growth, 7.2%. England, 14.9%. The rest of the UK, the whole of the UK, 12.9%. They would be better going back to their nation and to their constituencies and driving economic progress forward. My honourable friend who's doing such work in this area, the member for Watford, and he talks about fairness, which I know he stands up for fairness. I know he stands up for Watford, and I've seen these amazing montages all the times he has mentioned Watford in this chamber. So absolutely, he deserves to take the plaudits for the work he has done. And he says he was lucky. Well, as the great Gary Player said, the harder you work in life, the luckier you get. And the success that he has been the instigator of today is due to his hard work and determination. He talks about what we've done in terms of communications, working with employee groups, and working with the hospitality sector particularly. Yes, we do that, both trade unions, of course, and ACAS and others, and we work very closely with UK Hospitality, British Beer and Pub Association, British Innkeepers Institute and others to make sure that the code of practice and the guidance that will follow will make sure that they are fully cognizant of the requirements of the sector, a sector which is so important to our economies. My honourable friend, the member for North Wiltshire, who is still in his place, said he doesn't like tips. He doesn't like giving tips, and he is absolutely free not to give a tip if he doesn't feel that's appropriate. But most people would see, for good service, I think they were prepared to provide a tip. The key thing of this legislation is that tip should be retained by the individuals who provided the service. Happy to give way.
If I may perhaps just correct my right honourable friends, the impression he's given of what I said. I didn't actually say I didn't like giving tips. I do indeed like giving tips, and I'm quite a generous tipper, I think. However, I wish I didn't have to. I wish that people were paid enough so that tips were not necessary. That was the point I was making.
It makes a very good point. And of course, on that area, we've increased national living wage by record amounts this year to try and make sure people get paid well. But it did surprise me he wouldn't be a generous tipper, because he's always been generous in all my interactions with him. And finally, my honourable friend, the member for Ynys, talks about her constituents and the benefits this will bring for £900,000 in her constituency. I think she said she does a great job for her constituents. I've got to say my daughters are pretty pleased with it as well. They both work in our local establishments. So when the code and other provisions on tipping come into force in October, we will right the wrong and ensure that the money goes where it should to the workers who provided the service. We will continue to monitor the operation of this code and the major industries it covers, and will not hesitate to amend the code with parliamentary approval, of course, if necessary. I can also confirm that additional non-statutory guidance will be published before the code comes into force to provide further background and help employers remain compliant with the requirements. And, Madam Speaker, I commend the statutory code of practice on fair and transparent distribution of tips to the House, and that it be approved.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.